Welcome to the YouTube channel on poverty and culture. Our channel is dedicated to understanding how culture affects poverty and other social problems. Through discussions with our guests, we hope to understand that connection more deeply and thus find better answers. Our host is Larry Mead, a longtime scholar of poverty and welfare reform and the author of the recent Burdens of Freedom. Our initial ideas about culture come from this book, but the discussion may take us in new directions. David Azerrad is an assistant professor of government at Hillsdale College in Washington, D.C., and a former center director at the Heritage Foundation.
Welcome to our audience. I'm Larry Mead, a professor at NYU. We appreciate your interest in poverty and culture, a very important question. We mean by culture here pretty much what life is about, what people think they're trying to do in their lives. And the great theme is that America is divided culturally. We have a dominant culture that came from Europe with the immigrants that chiefly formed the country. But we also have minority groups that are part of America, but which came from outside Europe, from the non-Western world. And there are two important differences between these groups that we want to focus on. First of all, the dominant culture is individualist in the sense that people pursue their own goals largely. They think that that's what life's about. There's a movement of life from the inside out. On the other hand, the minority groups are coming from a non-Western culture that's more cautious, where people take their cues mostly from the outside world. They adjust to it rather than seeking to bring about change. Another key difference is for the dominant culture, moral attitudes tend to be abstract in general. They're moralistic. People have internalized ideas about right and wrong that are general and which they apply to all situations. On the other hand, the non-Western world, the moral structure is more conformist, more situational. People do what they sense other people want them to do. So it has a less abstract and general character. Now, we're not saying that one culture is better than another. We're not making that judgment here at all. In fact, there are definite weaknesses in both the West and the non-West. Each of them is good at some things, not good at some other things. And therefore, we're interested in just understanding the differences and their effects rather than making that kind of judgment. And also, these cultures have no necessary tie to race. We're not asserting that Western or individualist culture is somehow a white culture and the non-Western world is non-white. That isn't fundamental. The really important differences are indeed about attitudes, not about race. Obviously, there are connections to race, but we're not primarily talking about that. And we shouldn't be understood as saying that the culture is really a synonym for race. That isn't true here at all. Culture is independently important, and that's the thing that we're going to focus on. So let me stop there and ask David for his reactions.
Well, I first of all want to thank you, Larry, for having me. It's a real pleasure to talk to you. I also want to say that it really is a testimony to how intellectually bankrupt the academy is, that yours is a revolutionary idea, that culture matters, and that this is big news to scholars.
Yeah.
You would think not to in any way to diminish the significance of your work, but you would think that it's perhaps the most obvious of all propositions.
Yeah.
And yet it turns out to be out there and a somewhat a revolutionary one.
Yeah.
I obviously, my background is in political theory. You know, the category we would use in my discipline is the regime is what accounts for the great diversity of modes of being amongst human beings. And, you know, we speak of diversity today in the West in a very superficial sense, like different skin colors and who you have sex with. The really interesting diversity is what you're calling the cultural one, or the regime diversity, the different conceptions of the good, the different conceptions of human excellence, the different conceptions of vice and sin.
Yeah.
All of the extraordinary richness you find in genuine, authentic multiculturalism, not the bogus, shallow multiculturalism of the West, or say where I'm from in Canada, which is, you know, you go to an Indian cultural festival and then a Chinese New Year, and that's Canadian multiculturalism. I mean, really fundamental disagreements about what it means to be human and what the good life is. So I think it's impossible to disagree with you on that point. what I'm struck by in reading your book and listening to you talk is the extent to which the non-Western culture is gaining ground in the West amongst the elites.
Yeah.
With the rise of identity politics, critical race theory, wokeness, whatever you want to call this phenomenon, you see the emphasis on group allegiance rather than the individual.
Yeah.
And you see the erosion of the universal ethics, where we're moving slowly but surely towards a dominant moral framework in America, where whites are an accursed race who must be punished and humiliated in perpetuity for the sins of their fathers, and blacks and other people of color are sacred and increasingly exempt from the norms and laws of society. And this is not a fringe idea in America today that you need to go into the bowels of the internet to find defended. I mean, this is the dominant way of thinking in universities.
See, I agree with that. It is dominant, but it's also contradictory, because the theory of powerlessness, which it seems to me underlies identity politics, awards.
The theory of what, pardon me, Larry?
The conviction of identity politics that the groups that they're talking about are powerless is, to me, contradictory to the idea that this is new. In fact, what they're doing is awarding initiative to the very groups that they acclaim to be the oppressors. And therefore, a society which most European people find as experiences free is experiences the non-Western groups as unfree. And I think that's really true. They actually do sense the pressures about them coming in from the outside, coming from the dominant culture. That is really true. It's not a myth. Where we differ is whether it's a good thing or not. And certainly in individualist culture, we think it's a good thing, because those very qualities are what explain the dynamism and the essential honesty of Western culture, where it is in fact dedicated to achieving personal purposes of various kinds, yet constrained by the moral convictions of the culture as well. And the other side is a culture of adaptation to those forces. They're all the time reacting to what Western people want to do, because they're the dominant group in the society. That's really true. But what is the answer? The answer cannot be to destroy Western culture. I think right now the tendencies are in that direction, because the elite, although it remains thoroughly individualist itself, is so driven by guilt and adjustment that it is now seeking really to overthrow its own tradition in order to make room for the non-Western groups and make them feel more comfortable. But if we do that, we give up the qualities that have generated the enormously dynamic and powerful world that we live in, America and also Canada. These are countries of immense achievement, which reflects the culture. And you can't have it without that culture. And a striking thing is that the advocates of identity politics don't want to leave America. You think if they feel oppressed, they'd go somewhere else. No, they don't want to go somewhere else, because they don't really trust the other cultures. Those cultures don't have the moralism of the West. The moralism, after all, is what makes us pay attention to the demands of the outgroup. And that's good. That's basically a good thing. But it's been carried to such extremes that we're at risk of destroying our own tradition, the thing which the outgroups also depend on. That's the irony.
You pointed out two contradictions. They abound in dealing with this phenomenon, which, by the way, part of the difficulty is even knowing what to call it. In a certain sense, identity politics is a bit too anodyne of a term. Yeah. It's also misleading insofar as it implies that everyone is entitled to have an identity that they're proud of. That it would imply that, we're going to move towards some sort of a tribal model of politics. Yeah. But in a tribal society, every tribe is entitled to defend its own interests. Not so under this regime, where there are the guilty, accursed tribes, and they must be punished, and then the innocent, sacred tribes of the victims. So I'm more comfortable calling it anti-white racism. Mm-hmm. It'll raise eyebrows, because all we are told day to day is that America is systemically racist against Black people, that there are, Ta-Nehisi Coates and Ibram Kendi and Nicole Hannah-Jones have earned very comfortable livings, telling Americans how racist they are. I find that as a factual matter in 2021, it's sheer lunacy to assert that America is an open conspiracy by whites for whites against people of color. That's an utterly unsustainable proposition. I wouldn't call it an open conspiracy against whites, but the winds are definitely blowing in that direction. And so we should first gain some clarity as to what the phenomenon is. To your point about the contradictions, regrettably, they bounce off of these people like Teflon. I mean, it just doesn't stick. That to point out all of the incoherences. I mean, you brought out one of the greatest ones. If America is so horrible, why do you want to stay here?
Yeah.
Why are non-white people from the world over streaming in by the millions each year? Why would we bring them here? If America is so Islamophobic, why are we bringing in Afghan refugees to be tormented?
Correct.
And the thing is, I guess it's important to point out these contradictions for well-intentioned Americans to remind them of the sheer lunacy of the propositions that are being peddled by these elites. But in terms of persuading anyone to give up this nonsense, regrettably, I feel that we're well past the point of argumentation.
Well, there's one general recommendation I would make about that. One thing that makes me uncomfortable with most people who discuss identity politics, and this includes your own work, which is really the best of the best, but what it all does, it tends to repeat the arguments of the anti-racists and the identity politics people. You end up repeating their arguments and calling them absurd. Now, they are absurd, I don't deny that, but what's notably lacking is a counter-argument. We don't hear a rejection of the identity claim, only that it's excessive and unreasonable and so on and so on. What we don't see is a counter-argument. And what I think cultural difference offers is the beginning of a counter-argument, because we're saying to the identity groups, we're saying, no, this is incorrect. What you call identity is really an expression of the non-Western world. That is not what America's about. We value multiculturalism. We want people to be diverse. That's okay. But we're not going to give up an individualist culture, because that is, in fact, crucial to everything we've achieved. And therefore, we're going to reject your claims that the culture must be done away with to make life more comfortable for non-whites. We're not going to do that. That's wrong. And we're going to oppose it. And we're not going to pretend that there's any larger rationale for that. We're not saying this culture is better in any general sense, only that it has proved necessary to construct a civilized and orderly society. And I don't think anyone imagined this 200 years ago when this country was founded. At that point, there was no attention paid to the non-Western world. Afterwards, we paid quite a bit of attention since World War II and the dissolution of the European empires and all of that. But at that point, everyone imagined, and this was true when I was in graduate school, everyone imagined that non-Western countries would end up being different in very many ways, but they would be more or less as well governed as the Western world was. And that simply isn't true. On the contrary, they're falling apart. Afghanistan is only an extreme example of that. The great tragedy in the non-Western world is the failure of government. And the reason for that, I think, is cultural. It goes to the fact that this culture does not generate a civic culture that can uphold the rule of law and government by consent, whereas the West does have that, even though it is also critical of authority. So there's this paradox that a culture which is individualist, which questions authority and holds government accountable, is actually more strongly governed than societies that are more differential. That's the irony. And I mean, the great fact is there doesn't appear to be an alternative to the Western way of government. The other ways fall apart. And that's surprising. I don't think anybody in the West expected this 50 years ago.
So let me ask you a question then. Why won't you assert that Western culture is superior? Yeah. With all of the caveats, then, that it doesn't mean that there's a master race. It doesn't mean that we're not all equally human. It doesn't mean that we're not all made in the image and likeness of God. It doesn't entitle the West to colonialize, enslave, and harm. You add in all of the disclaimers. Yeah. But then, based on what you just said, isn't the conclusion that Western culture is ultimately superior?
I have to say no, because there are things it isn't very good at. In particular, this is not a culture for which aesthetic experience is central. Most Americans are not really interested in the arts. They're not really interested in a life of sympathetic attention to reality. They don't engage in mysticism or contemplation. It's not a culture which deals with life in the immediate sense. Our eyes are on the horizon. We're looking for future goals. And we always sacrifice the present to the future. And we have to do that to attain what we obtain. So there's a sense in which the West devalues the immediate experience of life. I think that's really true. And there's another feature which is even more important to me, and that is the non-West is able to deal with the things that cannot be mastered. See, the Western culture is a culture of mastery, in which individuals and collectivities set out to achieve important goals in the world, now and in the future. And so it's a culture of control, culture of confidence. Well, but not all of life can be mastered. There are tragedies we all have to deal with. Uh, Things that go wrong in our own lives, the fact that our relatives die, the fact that eventually we die. There are real limitations to the human experience. And the non-West is better at dealing with tragedy, with dealing with the things that cannot be mastered. And that's a quality we need, actually. And that's why multicultural culture should include values that we don't have in the West and which we need to learn from. I buy that. But on the other hand, I don't want to go to the extreme of giving up the core optimism and the forward-looking quality, the inner-driven quality of Western culture. Now, that culture is not for everyone. One thing Americans have to accept is that individual's culture is not universal. America is not a universal nation. The individual's culture is, in fact, a small part of humanity. It's getting smaller, and that's going to happen just due to demographic trends. So this culture is not taking over the world, and it makes unusual demands on people. The burdens of freedom are heavy. And I don't think I wouldn't agree with the statement that we tend to agree to, that the whole world wants to be free. I'm not sure about that. Freedom is difficult. And there are a lot of people who would like to have other people tell them what to do. And that's what goes on in the non-Western world. Most of these cultures are strongly differential to authority. They let higher-ups tell them what to do. We don't want that. We want to have individuals be free, but that's not for everyone.
So I'd have two reactions to that. One is, I wonder if you shouldn't more sharply distinguish America from Europe, because as much as we can criticize America's at times unrefined aesthetic sensibilities, in particular when it comes to architecture. I mean, if you look at Europe, classical music, painting, sculpture, and then architecture, I mean, it's arguably the most beautiful works produced in any civilization at any time have come from Europe. And the Americans are much more restless than Europeans. This anxiety, this restlessness. So Tocqueville saw it already in the 1830s when he came to America, but he came from the world of Europe, and he was struck by it. So the Americans are more outgoing and entrepreneurial than, say, the Southern Italians, or then actually the Mediterranean people of Europe, the Greeks, the people in Southern France. So that's one point. The other is, even if you're right that the West is not the best at everything, which I think no one would assert, couldn't one still say that on the whole, when you look at the good and bad of each one, the West is the best culture? Best doesn't mean perfect. It doesn't mean best at everything. But then when one does a comprehensive assessment, and I say this in part because to build off of your point that it's not enough to criticize identity politics and the wokeness. We need to have an alternative. But I think part of the alternative is regaining the self-confidence that used to characterize our civilization.
Yes.
That we believed in ourselves, we were not ashamed of our past. And I wonder, I want to talk to you, I want to put the question to you. isn't part of regaining this self-confidence, shedding the guilt and the bad conscience, to once again have a sense that ours is the best culture, the best way of life. It doesn't mean we need to impose it on everyone. It doesn't mean we're entitled to harm anyone. But I think it might be healthy to put that out there.
Yeah, I go part way with that in the sense that the governmental tragedy that we see in the non-Western world today, much of it is simply collapsing, producing these armies of migrants who are trying to come to the West any way they can. I mean, the fact that they're doing that is an incredible indictment of the governmental experience of the non-West. They're basically saying, we can't live in our own country any longer. We have to somehow seek the shelter of the West. And that shelter is primarily the rule of law. That's what we have in the West, and that depends on the moralistic culture. So I go there, and that is so important that it could finally lead to say, well, okay, then the West must be seen as the dominant culture. Okay, but I'm reluctant to say that because I don't want to in any way continue what I think identity politics does, which is to put up the West on a huge pedestal. See, they claim to be critical, but actually the qualities they attribute to Western culture are the qualities of dominance and mastery. They object to those things, but it's humiliating that they have to object to those things. Deeply humiliating. So we need to be honest about the limitations of the West. It isn't everything. I think what is more important is not that we have to say the West superior, but the point of confidence is really fundamental. I think that is the place where one senses a deep deficit, that the non-Western world is in fact lacking in confidence, because confidence is the quality of believing that you can go and do the things that you intend. And that is in fact not a major feature of the non-West. They really do need to take that on board. And that's what they should get from the non-West, from the West. When you see the successful anti-poverty programs that we have, and there are a few, what they above all say to the people they're serving is, you can do this, you can do this. That you don't have to wait for the world to change outside you. You can actually bring something about yourself. And that they do, and that maybe is the core of the idea of agency, the idea that I personally can bring something about in the outside world. That's the movement from the inner to the outer. That is what the West is all about. And put an end to the other reflex of the non-West, which is to go from the outer to the inner. See, in the non-West, life flows from the outside in. You take your cues from the environment and the authority figures out there, and you do what they say, and you make yourself comfortable as far as you can in the world that you've been given. Whereas the West says, well, I want to improve the world. I want to do something different and better. But when you do that, you take risks, and above all, you shoulder the burdens of responsibility.
So
and
I would say
is really the core idea in individualism.
So I would say two things to that. One is that kind of self-confidence is indeed alive and well in American elites. My sense is every single college application essay written in the past 30 years is about how this person is going to change the world and make it a better place. However, the kind of self-confidence I'm talking about is the civilizational self-confidence. Mm-hmm. The fact that we have elites that are not willing to defend our way of life. So they want to make the world a better place by finding a cure for cancer, curing AIDS in Africa, and doing some sort of a startup. But the civilizational self-confidence that you see, for example, in the Chinese ruling class, or honestly, for that matter, the one big outlier in the West to me is Israel. That is one society that, for all its problems, you really have no doubt that the elites, the ruling class, want to keep Israel alive as is. Whereas it is very hard to see across the West, the ruling classes we have, and think that, yes, these people want to preserve our way of life. They're not ashamed of their heritage. So this is the kind of self-confidence and boldness that needs to be bolstered, not the entrepreneurial, outgoing one.
Yeah.
And I'm less worried about that than I am in the collapse of the country and of the civilization because of a ruling class that is not only it's one thing to have a loss of a will to live. I think you find examples of that in history. People who just grow tired of living, grow soft and complacent because of material well-being, cease having babies, and are ultimately conquered by a stronger, more primitive people. I, however, can't think of a precedent in human history for a civilization whose elites are actively trying to destroy their patrimony, who jubilate at the thought of demographic transformation. I've never seen that anywhere else. And that rod has to be excised because ultimately, that's the root of the cancer. We've had pretty good entrepreneurial growth in America and innovation in many domains. Peter Thiel says not that much in the past 50 years. Nevertheless, there's still some dynamism here. The real problem is the civilizational lack of self-confidence.
Yeah.
Not just lack of self-confidence, let's be honest, self-hatred, guilt, bad conscience.
Okay, I agree with that. And in fact, it's a misunderstanding of our religious tradition to imagine that we should be flagellating ourselves. That isn't how God is imagined in the Old Testament, New Testament. No, yes, there's a focus on good behavior and repentance when one does something wrong, but always the goal is to turn around and go forward. There's no premium attached to flagellating oneself. That's simply false. That isn't what we're about. We have a mission in the world, whatever that may be, and that's more important, and we should get on with it. And we do get on with it. So I guess I'm less convinced than you that the attacks on the culture coming from the elite are sincere. Their actions belie their words. This is, after all, a masterful group. The current ruling class is primarily credentialed by having gone to elite universities, and they've had lives of tremendous fortune, which they're to some extent guilty about, even though it isn't their fault. And they have missions in life, which are quite impressive and generally other directed. They're trying to become successful personally, but it isn't just that. They're focusing on some good deed they're trying to do out there. So they are thoroughly Western, thoroughly individualist. That's the irony, even though they claim that temperament is hard on minorities. And it is indeed hard on minorities. I wouldn't deny that for a second. But what we should be doing is focusing on helping minorities take on board the burdens of freedom so they can also enter into that life. And of course, some do. We all have Black associates, friends who are as masterful as one could wish. They are just like you and me. They're overdriven overachievers. They couldn't do what they do without that temperament. In so doing, they often set aside other important goals in life. That's true. But they show it can be done. And when you have that temperament, then you suddenly are accepted in the society. Society is not interested in focusing on race. It is very much interested in focusing on temperament. And what we want is people who have a sense of confidence, who move towards their goals, and who are undefeated by the struggles that every life involves. And so I don't see that the paradox is we have a triumph of identity politics, but meanwhile, the Biden administration is characterized by an elite. If you look at the senior officials in the Biden administration, some extraordinary number of them, not only have they gone to elite schools, a fair number of them are Rhodes Scholars, which is probably the most selective fellowship in the business. These are extremely confident people. They have to be, or they could not have done these things. And for them to talk about weakness, that's out of character. What they need to be doing is saying to the people who feel defeated, no, you need not be defeated. The game isn't over. There are other things you can achieve. And we refuse to accept defeat as the final outcome of anybody's life in this country. And that should be the message. So yeah, there are people who've had a hard time, people who've done the wrong thing, people who've come out of prison, so on. But those people are in bad shape, no question. But their lives are not over. The game is not over. We need to say to them, you can do something worthwhile and be proud of it. See, that should
Larry, you're not going to get any disagreement from me on that front. The insanity of our age is that, let's be honest, what you just said, according to contemporary standards, is racist.
Yeah.
Now, I say this, I know you well enough. You don't have a racist bone in your body. Your book is the antithesis of racism. You explicitly reject this idea. But let's be honest, the discourse you are the advice you're giving, which by the way would be described as American common sense. Work hard, make an effort, don't get discouraged if you fail, try again. Today, that's considered racist. That's considered blaming the victim. That's considered denying the structural racism. So it shows you how far the rot. And by the way, to call someone a racist today in America is the equivalent of calling someone an atheist in the 4th century. Yeah. I mean, it is the central piety of the regime. Yeah. This is why, by the way, the elites will never admit that racism against Blacks and minorities is not the obstacle to getting ahead today that it was 100 or 200 years ago. Because they need the accusation of racism to silence critics. Yeah. To discredit people and not even have to bother to engage with their arguments. Yeah. It would be like in a very religious community to point at someone and say, this person doesn't believe in God. Well, from the moment you've said that, you don't need to listen to him. It doesn't matter what his arguments are. So we are dealing with.
Okay, maybe I think you're right that the charge of racism is silence criticism. I think that's correct. I do think it's necessary to dare that danger if one wants to confront identity politics.
Yes.
I've been called a racist for a long time. It's not new. I'm almost proud of it. I don't believe that I'm not deterred by that. Okay.
Good.
Now, it's easier for me to say this because I'm an academic and I have some protection against criticism. I'm allowed to do and say things that other people deeply disagree.
Excuse me. I need to interject. There are a lot of tenured professors in the academy, and they're all cowards. So yes. You're selling yourself short, Larry, because a lot of people have the protections you have, and choose to be cowards.
Yeah, but maybe they don't
take courage to speak out.
I think that's true, but on the other hand, they haven't come to the understanding of the problem as a cultural one. You see, if it were merely about good intentions, then everyone could be an anti-racist. But I think what's different about the viewpoint that I'm trying to develop here is that actually the racist issue is about culture, and that the deep difference isn't race at all, but ways of life. And what makes life hard for Blacks isn't that the whites take umbrage at people with non-white skin. I mean, that's absurd. That is not important by itself. Rather, whites take umbrage at a way of life that is destructive, self-destructive, which is hard on the society, hard on the perpetrators themselves. That's what we oppose. It's the way of life. It's not race per se. And in fact, the people that I know, and you know, I'm sure, who are Black, I cease to notice that they're Black. What I notice is what they say and do. They're like me. And we may disagree about the merits of what they're doing. We don't necessarily agree, but it's not about race. They're just like me. And that is what's important. So we should focus on that. And racism is a charge you have to risk to be candid about this. And I don't have to deny that there are racists out there. I think there are. There's a far right fringe, which is quite convinced that Black people are a different kind of animal from white people. That's absurd. There isn't any good evidence for that. We don't have to spend a lot of time on that. But we also have to be candid that white people have real reasons to differ with Black America today. And it isn't based on race, it's based on lifestyle. The big problem, which the anti-racists never talk about, is the dissolution of the underclass. It's low-income Blacks that primarily serve as a problem for the group. If you want to have integration in America, you can't talk about the elite. It's not going to achieve anything to give all of them visible jobs where they look like they're successful. That is not the white problem. The white problem is with the underclass, with people who are poor and whose poverty is entrenched. They're the ones we have to focus on. They're the ones who are in the worst off and require the most help and also the most structure. We need to say to them, freedom isn't free. You have to behave well in certain ways. Then you can experience the benefits of America. We have to say that without fear of being called racist. That's a risk I'm willing to take.
So to build on your point, let me ask you a question then. Do you see significant differences in the pathologies that afflict the Black underclass in America compared to the white underclass?
Not in principle, because the ways of life of, in my book, I talk about the declining working class, which is mostly white, lesser educated white men in particular. They, in fact, are behaving in a non-Western way. They're engaging in a life of survival rather than one of achievement. It's quite similar to what you see among blacks. There's, however, this difference. Most of the men involved had a more orderly, more forward-looking life earlier in their lives. They've gone over to a life of survival quite recently. So it's not as deeply seated. And certainly the traditions of the white population are quite individual, strongly so. So I think the solutions for the white poor are more apparent than is true for the black poor. Fundamentally, it's similar, however. And blacks are not to be seen as having a special cultural problem. In fact, if you look at the seriously poor groups among Hispanics, also Native Americans, these groups have all the same problems. One of the biggest arguments against racism as the origin of our problem is what's happened to Hispanics. This is a group that used to be in much better shape than it is today. Low-income Hispanics are falling apart. Their families are falling apart. At very high levels of crime, not as high as blacks, but much higher than whites. And this is a group that came to America voluntarily. They were never slaves. Now, it's true, there are some Hispanics who predate the American conquest of the West, and they did not choose to become Americans. But they're a small part of it. Most Hispanics came here to escape the collapse of their own countries in Mexico and Central America. And they're falling apart. And the reason is that they assume, as blacks also assumed, a structure of external authority to maintain order in their lives. And that is exactly what you don't find in the individualist culture. The forces of order have moved from outside to inside the self. And it's self-control that allows individuals to maintain control of their lives. They are inwardly burdened and therefore outwardly free. That's what the non-West doesn't get. And the advocates don't get it either. They think their groups are oppressed. And therefore, the answer is to shove back the external pressures that they're under. No, the answer is to internalize those demands and make them your claim. You now say, I have goals to live out, including the moral purposes that I have internalized. That is what makes me free. It's precisely because I take on those burdens that I can be free outwardly. I don't know why this is so obvious. This shouldn't be a problem. The idea that America is all about freedom in some libertarian sense is crazy. This country is not easygoing. Most people who get anywhere have done so by internalizing a whole set of goals. And those goals are the biggest burdens they bear. They're not free.
But that would be freedom properly understood, meaning
yes.
There's the ordered liberty of Republican self-government, and that is necessary to be successful in a bourgeois commercial republic, versus the licentious liberty of to hell with all of you, and I want to do whatever the hell I please, and if it feels good right now, I want to do it. So I think the two claims are not incompatible.
They are, and I mean, I wanted to ask you a bit about political theory. See, one of the reasons we have problems understanding what we're talking about is that the traditions in political theory are all individualist. The whole Western canon, all the great philosophers and thinkers, all take individualism for granted. There really is almost nothing that I can think of written by anyone who seriously entertained a different kind of personality, where people were passive, where they were reacting to outside demands, and they were comfortable to do so. No, that isn't our tradition. The theoretical tradition is all of people who are inner-driven, who have goals, and they resist oppression because they want to be free. See, that isn't the normal human experience. We take that as universal, but it isn't universal. And we see that when immigrants come to this country from these desperately poor countries where they never knew any freedom in the American sense. And they come in here and they expect to be better off than they were in the old country. And they certainly are in some practical sense. We're not going to lock them up at night. We're going to have order. We're going to have rule of law, et cetera, et cetera. But then suddenly they face all these demands to work, to get ahead, to compete. They didn't face that in the old country. And that is what defeats the non-Western groups, is they simply are not organized to succeed because they don't think of life in this inner-driven sense. That is their problem, and not race.
The way I always put it to my students is, I tell them, in the West, the question we ask today is, why is there poverty in the world?
Yeah.
And that's the wrong question to ask. The better question is, how do we account for these handful of anomalies in human history
Yeah.
that are not living lives of misery and
Yes.
of oppression? And it shows you the immense success of the modern project, that we now expect peace and prosperity and freedom and good government to be the norm, even though it has never been and does not remain the norm. And when we don't find, we're perplexed by it, and we think that this is what requires an explanation. Why is it that Burkina Faso doesn't have a space program? This is somehow perplexing to us. The better question is, how is it rather that America did what it did?
Yeah.
Or
yes.
We're victims of our success to a large extent.
Yeah.
That the prosperity and the peace has corrupted us, and that's an old story.
Yeah, I think that's right. America is not normal. America is exceptional. The whole Western world is exceptional. I just came back from a trip to England where I was doing things totally unconnected to my work. I was sailing a boat. Anyway, the British are an anomalous country. This is a originally poor, windswept country with a terrible climate and all kinds of adversities. And somehow they built the world's largest navy and they ended up running half the world. Okay, how did they do that? Well, they had a temperament that just said they were going to do what they intended to do. Now, they're not quite as individual as in America, but it's close. And they created a world in which freedom was possible because of the individualist character of the people. They could tolerate freedom, and they could tolerate the market, tolerate competition. And it is that gave them their power. And Europe as a whole, a little bit later, but not much later, came along in that same direction. But that isn't true of most of the world. There's a strain of thinking that I'm following pretty closely right now, where actually you can look at the anti-colonial revolts going on, including the Taliban in Afghanistan, and see this as a revolt by the non-West against the world economy, against the globalized economy. What they really object to is actually individualism. They object actually to competition, to the need to struggle and compete, because it's that struggle that generates the wealth. And they don't want to pay that price. They'd rather be not so rich, but more orderly, more settled, less challenged. They live in a society where distinction was not awarded based on performance, but based on status, based on connections. See, that's what the elite is driving us towards in this country. They want to protect the non-Western groups by giving them some kind of secure status where they will be secure, but where they don't have to compete. So,
Larry, this is a paradox. I don't think maybe you will disagree for your argument, but China today is more meritocratic than America. I mean, my impression is, look, to be admitted to a Chinese university, I'm sure that there are a handful of spots reserved for children of very high-ranking members of the Communist Party, but on the whole, it's a blind admissions test. Whereas our so-called elite universities, to be admitted, well, yeah, you could get in because you have good grades, or because your parents went there, or because your parents donate, or because you're gay, or because you're Black, or because you row.
Yeah.
We do not have a meritocratic admission system for our universities. Similarly, in the private sector, ours is a hybrid regime, is the way I would put it. There is still a meritocratic element in America, in the private sector, and in universities. There is still room for excellence on the basis of your talents. But on the rise, the winds are in the sail of the allocating positions on the basis of diversity, of how oppressed you are in the hierarchy, the totem pole of victims. And there's still a lot of dynamism left in this country, but let's be honest, the forces of diversity are on the rise. They have the backing of the law behind them. And meritocracy is in decline and assaulted on all sides.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's the way the trends are. But I also, as one who teaches in a big university where admission is mostly merit-based, I see a lot of people with energy and who are prepared to compete. And indeed, there are minorities too, who are given some preference, no question about that. but not enough to change the overall tone of the institution. So I think although the trends are bad, and I certainly oppose the extremes of affirmative action that we've seen, I wouldn't say they've gone as far as to make meritocracy absurd. If that were to happen, you would see a revolt in this country, and it would be at the expense of all preferences. Now, you also mentioned China. China is, in a sense, meritocratic, but the trouble with Asia in general is that they don't really have an individualist ethos. And so people get into the top universities in China by scoring well on tests. But we know when those students come to this country, they have a very hard time asserting themselves. Asian students I found to be quite difficult to teach. They're oriented primarily to getting the approval of the teachers. They are disturbed by teachers like me who invite challenge, who want people to argue with them, who are unafraid of argument. That's an individualist thing. And Asia is really troubled by that. And
I have a great anecdote for you, Larry. My friend Joshua Mitchell at Georgetown taught at the American University in Iraq for many years in northern Kurdistan. And, these are kids who went to school under Saddam's regime. And he said they were just incapable of saying what they believed. They just repeated what the professor said all the time. And at one point he said out of exasperation, he says, listen, stop repeating what I said. I want you to begin all your sentences with, I think that.
Yeah.
And he said what they started doing is saying, I think that, and just repeat what he had said.
Yeah. No, see, but that's the typical way of the world. See, the idea that you can have open discussion based on what people truly believe, and yet also have order. See, the great American achievement, the Western achievement, is to reconcile freedom and order. So yes, we do permit individuals to break ranks, to make fresh arguments, and that from that comes the dynamism of the country. But at the same time, we preserve order because good behavior is expected, good manners are expected. You don't insult people, you don't do other things to humiliate people, but you have legitimate arguments about issues.
Larry, I don't disagree with you about this is what the West and America used to be. I think maybe we disagree about how far the rot has progressed today. Our universities today are most emphatically not places where you can disagree with the authorities. It turns out that the authorities are teaching a different message, namely that Blacks are sacred, that homosexuals are sacred, that women are sacred, that white men are evil. These are the central pieties of the regime. No one disagrees with them. People get canceled and suffer social death and get fired if they challenge them. So yeah, you're allowed to question, something in the far reaches of biochemistry if you have a new way of thinking about it. But the number of topics that are off limits because they're so-called racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic is on the rise. And my impression now, I'm lucky to teach. This is if people from Hillsdale are hearing this, they may think I'm ungrateful. Hillsdale is not like that. It's a rare exception in the landscape. But when I talk to my friends who teach at elite universities, when I go there to give talks, when I meet students in DC who are interning, what they're describing is not this ideal, the Western ideal of challenging authority and questioning. Our elites are actually quite conformist. So you mentioned the Rhodes Scholars. I mean, the ones you meet, not that I've met that many, have been taught to jump through all of the hoops to get ahead in American life and to not really take risks. You look at someone like Pete Buttigieg, who's got the perfect resume, but is actually really not that impressive personally. To succeed in America today, to climb the ladder, it seems to me you actually need to be quite risk averse. You need to be quite cautious not to say anything at any point that will come up in your Senate confirmation hearing. And they end up being quite timid. So yeah, they may display a bit of daring in some entrepreneurial venture, but you don't see the bold intellectual daring that has characterized the West for a long time. You see a sheepish, conformist elite and population that is traumatized to say something that might perhaps be construed racist by someone.
Yeah, I think that's the way things are going. I don't differ about that. I don't know that it's gone quite as far as you're suggesting. I also am more confident that a resistance is growing, that
Yes.
right now, anyway, it's clear that equal opportunity, at least in government and the nonprofit sector, including the universities, is really not available to white men. That's true. We have been denied fair opportunity. But I also know, I mean, I was myself excluded from the university when I left graduate school, probably due to affirmative action, according to inquiry. But that turned out well for me. I actually got into work that was more important, and I certainly had more impact than I would have had if I continued with the subjects that I pursued in graduate school. So the fact is, it's hard to keep an assertive person down. If you have something to say and you have certain resources behind you, and not a great resources necessarily, you can go and do it. And the other people I know are often people who've had problems, who've not necessarily been successful first off, but they keep pushing and then they get somewhere. And it's the fact that you keep pushing. It's that generates the dynamism. And so I don't expect a lot of Americans from European backgrounds anyway to accept a life of passive conformity to the new ethos. They don't talk that way in private. They know they don't like it. I mean, my kids, both of whom, by the way, who were adopted from China, they're not native born. Both of them are quite cynical about the ideology they're getting in school. They know that's not the truth. That's not what they see in their own family or among their friends. They are engaged in a meritocratic competition to get ahead. It's very clear, and they know that they have to do it. And no, the game isn't over. Not everyone can succeed at any one particular roll of the dice. That's true, but the game isn't over. You keep doing something else, and eventually you get somewhere. The key is to keep pushing and not to give up, and have some confidence in yourself. And I think that's the theme that you struck that I really resonate with. It's that really pays for the country and for the individual. You have to believe that. You have to go with it.
I agree with you that there is widespread dissatisfaction with the ruling class. I agree that a lot of people see through the lies of the regime. I think the opportunity is there for someone to harness that, deepen it, and mobilize it into a successful backlash. That hasn't really happened yet. Trump tried and did not succeed for a variety of reasons. Some are his fault, some are not his fault. But we also shouldn't, I'd counsel against two things. One is the false comforts of too much hopefulness. That while if something can't go on forever, it won't. And this is America and it's an exceptional nation. We fended off other challenges before. This is sheer lunacy. It has to go away. Not necessarily. I mean, this itself can breed a certain passivity that we don't need to do anything to defeat this rotten ideology because it'll disappear on its own.
I agree with that. It's going to be a struggle.
And we should also just be mindful of the magnitude of the endeavor, of the fact that the ruling class is quite powerful and only growing more and more powerful. So, I'm all with you with the pull yourself by the bootstraps message. I think it's a salutary one. But, what do you do? What do you tell the young academic who got canceled because he said something quote unquote racist? We're soon coming to a point where private businesses will say, I don't want to bank with you, or be denied access to airlines because you're a racist. Or, I mean, their ideology is on the march. More and more sectors of American life are being infected by it. And one should not underscore the magnitude of the task before us if we want to reestablish this kind of old American ethos that you so nobly defend.
Well, thanks very much. I think that's well said, and I share your goals. I think that you've done a good job indeed in discussing identity politics and making it clear what's involved. And certainly it's a pernicious thing. It needs to be defeated. And I'm a little more optimistic that it will be. I believe there is a counter movement developing. One thing we see in the schools where my kids have been subject to indoctrination, the parents are now rebelling against identity politics indoctrination in the school level. And I think we're going to see a backlash at the next election. This is not something that most Americans want. And the result is going to be some movement back the other way. But it's going to take a long time. And I do think that
Yes.
there's danger. I do agree with that. Anything more to say? Anything we haven't said?
I guess I would just tell you, I don't want you to think I'm pessimistic or I'm dour, or as the kids say, that I've swallowed the black pill. I would say that I'm cheerful, but perhaps not hopeful. But that I'm not. I think it would be, even if we have already lost, no one can know for sure. And I think that it would be the most un-American thing to give up on America. That would be my message. So I'm against the false comforts of false hope, but I'm also against the bitter black pill of despair.
Okay, well, that's very well said. Thanks very much, David. I'm sure we'll interact further about all this. So thanks.
My pleasure. Thank you, Larry.
Good, my pleasure. We have run out of time. I'd like very much to thank David Azerrad for participating in this discussion and offering his point of view. Please share this video with others and make sure to subscribe to our channel. Several other discussions of poverty and culture are also available on this channel. We urge you to view them, as everyone is different. In later weeks, we'll have further discussions of poverty and culture with other discussants. I'm Professor Larry Mead, and thank you again for watching.